So I really think without further ado, Professor Putnam, can I invite you to address the audience? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a terrific pleasure for me to have a chance to talk with you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm going to try to speak briefly, although friends in the audience will know that that's something that I don't always find easy to do, so those friends will start going like that when I've talked too long. I hadn't planned actually to talk mainly about the Harvard-Manchester program. I planned to talk mainly about social capital, but maybe I should say just a word or two first about the Harvard-Manchester program. Big social changes, like the Industrial Revolution, are always controversial. I say big social changes, I mean things like the Industrial Revolution, or the Internet Revolution, or the Women's Revolution, or liberation movements over the course of the 20th century, Black Civil Rights Movement, for example, in the United States. Big social changes like that are always controversial, partly because, and sometimes they come from technological changes, the Industrial Revolution and the Internet Revolution driven mainly by technological change. Sometimes they come from cultural changes, religious revivals, or the set of cultural changes that led people in North America and Western Europe to become more sympathetic to the rights and role of women. Those are not driven mainly by technology, but mainly by cultural changes. But no matter where they come from, those big social changes like that are always controversial for at least three reasons. First of all, they genuinely have upsides and downsides, so to speak. There's advantages and disadvantages. I mean, the Industrial Revolution brought great wealth, but also dark satanic mills. The Internet Revolution has great potential for increasing our individual access to information, but on the other hand, it also has the potential for being yet another glowing screen that we sit in front of in an isolated way. So all these big changes have within them both positive and negative potential. That's the first point. The second point is any of those big changes like that are good for some people and bad for other people. And so there's tensions about who gets the benefits of a big social change like, as I say, these that I've talked about. And thirdly, and probably most interestingly and relevant actually to this city, is that often the benefits of big social changes come later and the costs come earlier. So that, for example, the Industrial Revolution, the net effect of the Industrial Revolution over the long run on life expectancy and health was very positive. If you look around the world, the places in the world that have had the Industrial Revolution are places that have basically high life expectancies and high levels of health. But the short-run effect of the Industrial Revolution in this city and in the other cities in this area and in Birmingham and so on, the short-run effect was very bad. Life expectancy dropped by 10 years during the early years of the Industrial Revolution. So if you stopped the motion picture 10 or 15 or 20 years into the Industrial Revolution and said, is this a great thing or a bad thing, it would have been crazy to say it was a great thing. It was people were dying a lot younger than they had been when they were living in some rural community. And but in general, what happens, and this is the Industrial Revolution is a good example of this. What happens in these cases of large-scale social change is that there's powerful incentives to understand, well, what's going on? Why does this Industrial Revolution lead to higher rates of death? And in that case, as you probably know, the discipline of sociology was born, and the discipline of public health was born as academic disciplines. And after a while, it became clear that it was basically clean water and better treatment of sewage would cause that downside of the Industrial Revolution to go away. And it was in the cities of northern England in the first half of the 19th century that one first saw this alignment or alliance, so to speak, between academics, scholars interested in a particularly set of interesting puzzles, like why did people die more if they were living in industrial cities. Academics on the one hand, scholars on the one hand, and local officials and local activists on the other hand, to try to understand mutually what the nature of the problem was and try to figure out how can we benefit from the upside potential of these changes and minimize the downside potential. In the case of the Harvard-Manchester Program on Social Change, what we're trying to do is, over a 5-year period, pick out a couple of the large-scale changes that are happening either in the United States or in the UK or both, and try to understand what are the potential positive sides and what are the challenges that are associated with these changes, and how can we minimize the downside and maximize the upside. And so we're looking at, for example, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a second, issues of immigration and diversity, looking at issues of growing inequality, growing class cleavages, at least in the United States. I don't want to say that I know this is true in Europe and in the UK, because I don't yet know it is, but certainly in the United States there's a growing class gap, not just racial, but class gap in America, and we want to try to understand why that is. And for sure it is true in the UK, as you know, that the income gap has been growing between rich and poor here. That's the second area that we're looking at. We want to look at issues of citizenship and how that's changing in the modern world. We want to look at questions about religion and how that is changing in the modern world, and it's changing in different ways, actually, on the two sides of the Atlantic. So that's the agenda of this Harvard-Manchester program. It's not an accident that the UK pillar of this arch, so to speak, rests in this city, because it's I'm not trying to patron or falsely praise you, but this is a really interesting city, as you know. I'm only saying that from the outside. It's a really interesting city. It's a city that has faced lots of challenges, has great potential, and is a great place for learning about the challenges that modern societies elsewhere face. So that's the background to the Harvard-Manchester program. I'm happy to answer more questions about that during the Q&A. But let me, if I can, go quickly to the question of really to those 4 questions. What is social capital? Why is it important? What's been happening recently to social capital? How is social capital related to equality and diversity? And what can government, and I don't mean only government here, I mean what can government and local activists do about social capital? And I'm not going to answer any of those questions exhaustively, but I want to say just a few words about each of them, so that to give you a chance to then push and probe and raise questions and doubts and clarifications and so on. Social capital, first, is a term. I know that this is a familiar term to you. Let me just say the way I look at it. Everybody knows what physical capital is. Physical capital is just some physical object, a tool, like a screwdriver or a wrench, and we invest in that tool, and we can repair more bicycles more quickly with the wrench than without a wrench. Economists began teaching us to talk about human capital about 30 years ago, by which they mean simply training and education. So just as you could invest in a tool, so too you could invest in training and education. That's what is going on at these great universities here in Manchester. And you, with the same tools, can be more productive with that human capital than you would without the human capital. And those of us who are interested in social capital are essentially saying, right, that's true, tools are valuable, training is valuable, but also there are features of our communities, features of the organizations in which we work and in the communities within which we live that also can make us more productive or make us less productive. If you, with the same tools, the same training, have the good fortune to live in a community or to work in an organization in which people are connected with one another in positive ways, productive ways, you can get more done than if you had the misfortune to live in a community or to work in an organization where you couldn't count on other people to pitch in. That's the core idea of social capital is so simple that I'm actually embarrassed to say it. The core idea is that social networks have value. Social networks have value. Social networks have value, many kinds of value, but they have value, first of all, to people who are in the networks. There are many examples of that. Most people in the UK, most people in America, most people in the modern world, it turns out, as students of labor markets have taught us, get their jobs more through whom they know than through what they know. I'm not talking about patronage or nepotism. I'm simply saying most people don't get their jobs through a want ad. Most people get their jobs because somebody knows about you, or you know somebody who knows about a job, and that kind of social networks help you get jobs and improve your jobs, or me. I mean, the same thing is true for me. So powerful is this effect on your employment prospects that an economist at the University of Chicago Business School, that's where they do this kind of calculation, has calculated for the average American the dollar value of his address book, or her address book. That is, in terms of the lifetime income, having the right kind of address book can make a huge difference. And in fact, the dollar value of most people's address book is greater than the dollar value of all the degrees that they have in terms of their lifetime income. That's a little daunting for someone who's in the education business to say, but social networks have, in that case, financial value. Now, I probably am reinforcing all your stereotypes about Americans, that all we care about is the bottom line. There are many other examples of it, and I'm going to mention some other ones in a second, of the ways in which social networks are valuable to the people who are in the networks. But it's also important to pay attention to the fact that social networks also often have benefits for bystanders, not just for the people who are in the networks, but for bystanders. There are a lot of examples of this, too. One of them that I'm conscious of, actually, at this very moment, comes from the fact that criminologists studying the UK or studying the US, other places, have taught us that the best predictor of a low crime rate in a neighborhood is how many neighbors know one another's first name. If there's a lot of connections in the neighborhood, that has the effect of deterring crime. People just are, looking out for one another. And my wife and I have the good fortune to live in a neighborhood in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which has a whole lot of social capital. People are all the time having picnics and barbecues and sledding parties and so on. You know what a sledding party is? You know what snow is? Snow, sledding party. And so there's a ton of social capital in my neighborhood, and I'm confident that at this very moment, it's 7:30 in the morning. My home in Cambridge is being protected by all of that social capital right now. Even though, and this is now the moment for confession, I actually never go to the picnics and barbecues and sledding parties myself. I mean, I'm not proud of that fact. I'm actually a little embarrassed about it. But I'm able to benefit from those networks, even though I'm not in the networks. And what I've just finished saying, if you've had economics 101, is social networks have externalities. They have effects not just on the people in the networks, but on bystanders. And that turns out to be really quite important for a lot of reasons. One reason why social networks turn out to have almost magical properties, and I'm going to describe some more of those in a second, but one reason that social networks have these really quite astonishing effects is that it turns out that in an organization or in a community in which people are connected with one another in productive ways, what tends to evolve is a norm of generalized reciprocity. I know that's a highfalutin term. Generalized reciprocity just means I'll do this for you now without expecting something back from you, because down the road he'll do something for me and you'll do something for him, or you'll do something for her and she'll do something for him, and anyhow we'll all see each other at choir practice on Thursday. The core idea of generalized reciprocity, and therefore the core idea of social capital, was actually best articulated by a philosopher from New York City. One or two of you will have heard of this person. His name is Yogi Berra. Yogi Berra is a famous baseball player who has a way with words. And Yogi said, if you don't go to someone's funeral, they won't come to yours. It's a deep thought, actually. The longer you think about that thought, the deeper it becomes. Yogi captured the core idea of reciprocity, and in that sense captured the core idea of social capital. And that's the end of the lecture. Or that's the end of the academic part of the lecture. What I've just tried to convey to you is what I mean by social capital. So the core idea here is very simple. Social capital simply refers to social networks and the norms of reciprocity that go along with that. And the claim is that on the whole, communities, organizations that have more of that social capital